Hey friends, welcome back to Torah Homestead. As you can see, I am still here in Oregon. This will be my last Shabbat Prep Day Radio filmed at Mom's, at least for this year. We are headed home in just a couple of days. So I wanted to make this episode of Shabbat Prep Day Radio about the idea of preparedness and prepping to an extent. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes, and then I actually have an interview that I did with my mom on the topic of preparedness. So she's going to give us just a few of her thoughts, and then we'll go into the reading of our classic novel. Now, we know that our nation and our world is facing a lot of crazy. I don't even need to detail it out for you all because you know. And I think that that can put us in a few different, emotional states that aren't normal. Just a lot of fear and concern, a lot of worry, and just stress, right? We want to be ready, but we don't know what it is that we are to be ready for. We want to be prepared and make sure that we being good stewards, but we don't know exactly what it is that we should do. If I spend, my extra money on this load of grain, am I missing out on this water collection system? If I decide that I'm going to buy 50 pounds of beans, maybe I should have actually bought a new generator or something. So we have all kinds of different, what should we do? How should we prepare? Should we put anything away? Or should we just leave it all up to the Father and let Him guide us day by day? I definitely think we should leave everything up to the Father and let Him guide us day by day. But sometimes He does that by showing us what we can do to prepare, like He did with Noah, right? And sometimes He does that by just having us trust Him every single day for our daily allowance, like He did with the Israelites in the desert and their daily allowance of manna that would go, rotty and maggoty if they left it till the next day. So the real issue here is are we asking the Father what He wants us to do for our own situation, right? But I think something that has me concerned is that I'm looking around me and I'm reading and I'm watching, and I just am sensing just a general kind of stress and worry and almost into panic mode in some of the people around me. And that concerns me, right? Because the Father really does have us in His hands if we will trust Him, if we will walk with Him, if we will learn from Him, if we will obey Him, and we make Him our God. He really does have us in His hands, and He really will lead us and give us instructions for every day, day by day, and preparations ahead of time, just depending on our situation. So I guess my concern is I think that we are focusing our energies in the wrong direction with all this stress and worry and trying to figure out what should we do, when mainly our energy needs to be focused on Him and listening, right? The more you know Him, the better you can hear Him. And the better you can hear Him, the better you can understand His instructions for you. I think if you're, wanting to expend some energy on preparedness and you don't know where to put that energy, definitely put it into growing your spiritual relationship and into learning about Yahweh and what He has to say in His Word and how He teaches us and how He speaks to us. Now, my channel is called Torah-led Homestead. That means that I try to live a Torah-led life, following the Father's instructions that He gives to us within the first 5 books of the Bible. However, today I would really like to emphasize the words of Yeshua. I think that it would really help when we are getting into those stressful, worried, panicky sort of modes, that we go back to the words of Yeshua. In most Bibles, they are highlighted in red and can be found in the first 4 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I do believe there's a little bit in the beginning of Acts, and then also in Revelation. We have His words and His encouragement and His instructions to us, and I think that this is a time when we really need to hold on to the things that He said when He talked about not worrying and trusting the Father to take care of us, to provide for us, right? He talked a lot about not worrying. He told us not to worry about, what we will eat and how will we be clothed and, how will we be provided for, because the Father is watching out for us. And in other places, He tells us to not worry about what we will say when we face persecution, when we face questions, when we face things that seem overwhelming, in situations where we have to defend ourselves. He says, don't even worry about what you're going to say, because I will fill your mouth and I will give you those words when it's time. He really does have our backs in every situation. And I think we just really need to remember to trust in him during these times. Every time a worry creeps up, every time a concern creeps up, just hand it over to him and say, I'm giving this to you and I don't want it back. And he will take care of those things. Some people say that God helps those who help themselves. That's not biblical. That's not who our God is. He doesn't expect us to sit on our hands and do nothing, but he does expect us to listen for instructions. But he helps us because we can't help ourselves, right? But he does give us some steps and some things that he does require of us, right? In our walk with him. So I think if we focus on learning what those things are and then walking them out in obedience, I think it will go well for us. When we get home from our trip out here to Oregon, I'm really going to be jumping into physical prepping mode, which I do every spring. I missed a little bit of that window as I was preparing for this trip, so I'm going to kind of have to up my game a little when I get home. I'll start off by visiting a couple of berry farms and getting our berries put away for the year, and then by then my garden should be coming in fairly decently, but I have a lot of canning that I want to be doing, and dehydrating and just preserving of food, and so I hope to be videoing some of that and giving you guys some of my steps. If you have anything particular that you would like to learn about, please let me know and I will try to make a video on that. And I'd also like to make some videos on cooking outdoors. A few of you have requested that I do some outdoor cooking videos, talk about just how to cook over a campfire, how to do things, what we would say primitively. But it really hasn't been that long ago that most people were cooking over an open flame. So we'll do some of that kind of stuff. So let me know if there's anything else that you guys can think of that you'd like to learn about, and we'll see if we can get a video made for that. So now I want to go into this little interview that I did with my mom. It has just been a joy to visit with her about some of the things that we enjoy together and that we have in common. So I really hope that this blesses you. Hey friends, welcome back to Toilet Homestead. Today, Mom and I are going to talk about preparedness for Shabbat Prep Day Radio. So the idea of preppers, there's a lot of stigmas out there and ideas about what people think are preppers, people who prepare. So we just want to talk a little bit about that on a practical side. Preppers are not always and not even usually preparing for like the end of the world, right? It's not like we're all just going to hide away in a bunker and that's what we're preparing for. But we just prepare for just occurrences that could happen at any time. Power outages, or maybe you have severe weather, or you just have you lose income for a couple of months or something. So there's all kinds of different reasons why it's good to be self-sufficient and prepared ahead of time, just for uncertain times. So I have prepared a few interview questions for my mom, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how she views preparedness and some of the things that she does to be prepared. Because a lot of the things that I've learned about prepping, I've learned from my mother. All right, so Mom, what does it mean to you to be prepared, and what kind of things do you like to be prepared for?
Well, being prepared means having a plan if life as we know it were to change suddenly. And like in case of a natural emergency or a man-made emergency, having water available, easy to get, and a way to make it safe for drinking. Like you can buy those little pills at the camping section and get some quick water, things like that. Having non-perishable food stock, a plan for fishing, hunting, equipment, knowledge of berries and plants, having medicine and medical supplies and hygiene supplies, and just kind of keep in mind of what scenario could happen and be prepared for that scenario.
Absolutely. Not waiting till the last minute to get your stuff together.
You might get sick, not be able to go to the store for a week, and be prepared.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. It's just wise. Okay. So you grew up with a mother and a grandmother who went through the Great Depression years, the Dust Bowl, Oklahoma area, and then all of just the recovery that kind of came after that.
Back in the 40s and early 50s.
So can you just tell us a little bit about that? Do you have any stories that you remember, things that were, you went through growing up that you're kind of like, that was
Well, I
probably
wrote some notes. Let me take a look. I was thinking at one point my grandmother lived in a sod house with her parents and 11 siblings. And that was like 1939 to 1945. My mom was a child during World War II, so she was used to going without luxuries and conserving what they did have. Mom taught us how to avoid wasting food. She told me a story about when she she'd get a treat at school and she'd put it in her pocket and she'd bring it home to share with her little brothers.
Aww.
Yeah, she came west with her uncles, looking for a better life. So, it just helped me learn that I was fortunate because I had way more than I needed.
Yeah.
And Mom and Grandma both taught me a lot from what they went through in the Depression years.
Do you feel like they carried that on into a time when most of the people were back to prosperity again and back to kind of...
Well, I think my grandmother's generation probably never got over it. They saved their tin foil and reused it. Their aluminum foil, they called it tin foil in those days. And, I think Grandma Irma never did get over that. I think Mom, about in the 1960s when people started getting ahead and everybody had a nice car and we had plenty of food and stuff. Mom kind of got over it a little bit, but I don't think Grandma ever did.
Yeah, it would be really scary. Yeah, especially.
She always wanted to be prepared.
Yeah, good, awesome. All right, so what do you think are some good things to focus on if you are brand new to the idea of preparing? Like, I know for years I would just make a grocery list for, every 2 weeks. Like, we get paid every 2 weeks. I make my grocery list for 2 weeks. And in my house was just the things I needed for 2 weeks. And the idea of having, extra, one, I didn't feel like I could afford to have extra in my house. And so I felt like I just had to, buy what I was going to need right then. And then I guess it was pretty immature thinking, but I would just think, that's not going to happen. Like, if that happens, somebody will come take care of me. Somebody will fix it.
And when you're younger, you don't, plan ahead. You live for today or next week. Yeah.
What are some things that a beginning prepper, someone who wants to start out, what are some good starting spots for them?
Well, I think a beginner prepper should focus on basics like water bath canning, a pantry with rice and beans and, things like that. You don't have to just go overboard, but I think if you're just beginning, like if you go to the store for the menu that you're going to make this week, maybe throw in a couple extra bags of rice, throw in some beans, extra salt and pepper. Salt's your friend, everybody needs to have salt and vinegar, and just throw in one or two extra things.
Yeah.
And before long, you're going to have a whole pantry full of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I started too. Just getting a little bit of extra of things that I know I always use.
Right.
And I've even gotten to that way in my gardening, rather than having a very diverse garden of 25 different vegetables. I know that I use pasta sauce, marinara, tomato sauce. I use that 3 times a week. So my garden this year is peppers and tomatoes, and that's pretty much it.
It's fun to have maybe one thing that's new and different, and you want to learn how to grow. But stick to your basics. I mean, if we're talking prepping because of an emergency, you're not going to have a gourmet meal. You need a meal.
Yeah, survive. Yep. Right. All right, good. Okay, what kind of foods and meals do you think are simple and inexpensive for people who are struggling? So a lot of people are struggling financially, just groceries are insane, whatever. What are some good ideas for simple, basic meals?
Well, I wrote down a few ideas. You're going to laugh at the first one. Spaghetti.
Oh, gee, I never ate that growing up.
Spaghetti, chili, cornbread. Large pots of soup,
Yeah.
I mean, anything will go in a soup pot.
Right.
And you can change it up and make it taste different. One day it can be like a tomato base, and next day it can be a beef broth base. And
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just simple one-pot meals.
Yeah. And saving your leftovers, because you can put stuff in, make a soup of all your leftovers.
If you have a veggie tray, setting out, and everybody had veggie and dip, and then tomorrow cut up your celery and carrots and drop them in your soup pot.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. We don't always have to do, like you said, big gourmet things. Just
Right.
kind of using up what you have.
Yep.
Okay, so what concerns do you have about this generation, I guess generations my age and Lindsay's age, in regard to their readiness to face an economic collapse or a food scarcity? Do you...
Well, sorry, but I think this generation might be in a world of hurt. Mm-hmm. Not every single person, because we've got some really good parents out there like you, but I think we've also got a generation that just doesn't get it. Yeah. Maybe I was telling you, I think I told you this story, I'll tell our viewers, that a while back I went to the grocery store and I bought a roast beef, and the young gal at the cashier was ringing me up, and she goes, "Oh, roast beef." She had said she was newly married and she wanted to make a roast beef for her husband, but I don't have an Instapot. Mm-mm. Yeah. And I'm thinking, I've never had an Instapot. And so I said, "Well, do you have a pan, honey?" And she's like, "Yeah, I have this big pot my mom gave me." And I go, "Okay, we'll put the roast in the pot and put a little water in it and put it in the oven."
Yeah.
And but the new generation, I don't think they understand.
Yeah.
They just, everything's so fast.
Right. It's
Quick,
easy
instant,
to get it.
Instant. Yeah. Everything's instant.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Even for me, who has been a homemaker for 25 years, there are certain things that I think of if we were to lose, if the grid went down or internet went down or whatever. I don't know. I've been taking notes, and I've just been keeping a binder of just like basics. Will I remember how to do this? Will I be back into a mind? Because I can remember when I was first married, I was in a very old-fashioned mindset, and trying to do things in an old-fashioned way. And now I have kind of bought into the convenience side of things.
Sometimes I think you do stuff even better as far as the old-fashioned way than I do, because I use my microwave a lot.
Yeah, I haven't had a microwave like 20 years.
I know. So, I think you're doing just fine.
Yeah, we just need to be creative in, ingenuity, and understand that the majority of history, we didn't have.
The key is we have to keep teaching our young ones. Yeah. We have to keep teaching our newlywed age women, to carry on. Yeah. And be teachable, be willing to learn from someone. Yes.
And be willing to
their attitude and their acceptance of the information that we're trying to give them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just a bunch of old fogies trying
my case.
So yeah, I do have that down here because earlier in the year on the channel I talked a lot about Titus 2 mentoring. Mm-hmm. And, in Titus 2 it talks about the older women teaching the youngers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it does have to do with, her relationships, as far as relationship with her spouse or her children or whatever. But there is, and with the father, but there is a whole element also of just that passing on the knowledge and wisdom that you have. And I think that teaching others these skills that we have is a big part of that too. It's practical.
Yes. I've learned so much from my grandmother. Yeah. I really did.
That's good. All right, do you have anything else you want to say about prepping?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right, I hope that inspired and blessed you guys. I am going to get into our Pride and Prejudice reading now. And so for those of you who don't stick around for that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. All right. We are in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We are in part 2 in chapter 9. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning and writing to Jane, while Mrs. Collins and Maria were gone on business into the village, when she was startled by a ring at the door. the certain signal of a visitor. As she had heard no carriage, she thought it not unlikely to be Lady Catherine, and under that apprehension was putting away her half-finished letter, that she might escape all impertinent questions, when the door opened, and to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room. He seemed astonished, too, on finding her alone, and apologized for his intrusion by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies to be within. They then sat down, and when her inquiries after Rosings were made, seemed in danger of sinking into total silence. It was absolutely necessary, therefore, to think of something, and in this emergence, recollecting when she had last seen him in Hertfordshire, and feeling curious to know what he would say on the subject of their hasty departure, she observed, "How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon, for, if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?" "Perfectly so, I thank you." She found that she was to receive no other answer, and after a short pause added, "I think I have understood that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again?" "I have never heard him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in the future. He has many friends, and he is at a time of life when friends and engagements are continually increasing." "If he means to be but little at Netherfield, it would be better for the neighbourhood that he should give up the place entirely, for then we might possibly get a settled family there. But perhaps Mr. Bingley did not take the house so much for the convenience of the neighbourhood as for his own, and we must expect him to keep it or quit it on the same principle." "I should not be surprised," said Darcy, "if he were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers." Elizabeth made no answer. She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and having nothing else to say, was now determined to leave the trouble of finding a subject to him. He took the hint, and soon began with, "This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford." "I believe she did, and I'm sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object." "Mr. Collins appears very fortunate in his choice of a wife." "Yes, indeed. His friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him, or have made him happy if they had. My friend has an excellent understanding, though I'm not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and in a prudential light it is certainly a very good match for her." "It must be very agreeable to her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own family and friends." "An easy distance, do you call it? It is nearly 50 miles. "And what is 50 miles of good road? Little more than half a day's journey? Yes, I call it a very easy distance." "I should never have considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match," cried Elizabeth. "I should never have said Mrs. Collins was settled near her family." "It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighbourhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far." As he spoke, there was a sort of smile, which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing her to be thinking of Jane in Netherfield, and she blushed as she answered, "I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and the near must be relative, and depend on many varying circumstances. Where there is fortune to make the expense of travelling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a very comfortable income, but not such a one as will allow of frequent journeys, and I'm persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance." Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her, and said, "You cannot have a right to such a very strong local attachment. You cannot have been always at Longbourn." Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glanced over it, said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with Kent?" A short dialogue on the subject of the country ensued, on either side calm and concise, and soon put an end to by the entrance of Charlotte and her sister, just returned from their walk. The tete-a-tete surprised them. Mr. Darcy related the mistake which had occasioned his intruding on Miss Bennet, and after sitting a few minutes longer without saying much to anybody, went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, he must be in love with you, or he would never have called on us in this familiar way." But when Elizabeth told of his silence, it did not seem very likely, even to Charlotte's wishes, to be the case, and after various conjectures, they could at last only suppose his visit to proceed from the difficulty of finding anything to do, which was the more probable from the time of year. All field sports were over. Within doors there was Lady Catherine, books, and a billiard table, but gentlemen cannot always be within doors, and in the nearness of the parsonage, or the pleasantness of the walk to it, or of the people who lived in it, the two cousins found a temptation from this period of walking thither almost every day. They called at various times of the morning, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and now and then accompanied by their aunt. It was plain to them all that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he had pleasure in their society, a persuasion which of course recommended him still more, and Elizabeth was reminded by her own satisfaction in being with him, as well as by his evident admiration of her former favourite George Wickham, and, though, in comparing them, she saw there was less captivating softness in Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners, she believed he might have the best informed mind. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage it was more difficult to understand. It could not be for society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips, and when he did speak it seemed the effect of necessity rather than of choice, a sacrifice to propriety, not a pleasure to himself. He seldom appeared really animated. Mrs. Collins knew not what to make of him. Colonel Fitzwilliam's occasionally laughing at his stupidity proved that he was generally different, which her own knowledge of him could not have told her, and as she would have liked to believe this changed the effect of love, and the object of that love, her friend Eliza, she set herself seriously to work to find it out. She watched him whenever they were at Rosings, and whenever he came to Hunsford, but without much success. He certainly looked at her friend a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there was much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but the absence of mind. She had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his being partial to her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea, and Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press the subject, from the danger of raising expectations which might only end in disappointment. For in her opinion, it admitted not of a doubt that all her friend's dislike would vanish if she could suppose him to be in her power. In her kind schemes for Elizabeth, she sometimes planned her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. He was, beyond comparison, the pleasantest man. He certainly admired her, and his situation in life was most eligible. But, to counterbalance these advantages, Mr. Darcy had considerable patronage in the church, and his cousin could have none at all. Chapter 10. More than once did Elizabeth in her ramble within the park unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. She felt all the perverseness of the mischance that should bring him where no one else was brought, and to prevent its ever happening again, took care to inform him at first that it was a favourite haunt of hers. How it could occur a second time, therefore, was very odd, yet it did, and even a third. It seemed like wilful ill-nature, or a voluntary penance, for on these occasions it was not merely a few formal inquiries and an awkward pause and then away, but he actually thought it necessary to turn back and walk with her. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or of listening much, but it struck her in the course of their third that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness, and that in speaking of Rosings, and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came to Kent again she would be staying there, too. His words seemed to imply it. Could he have Colonel Fitzwilliam in his thoughts? She supposed if he meant anything, he must mean an allusion to what might arise in that quarter. It distressed her a little, and she was quite glad to find herself at the gate in the Pales, opposite the parsonage. She was engaged one day as she walked in reperusing Jane's last letter, and dwelling on some passages which proved that Jane had not written in spirits, when instead of being again surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw, on looking up, that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. Putting away the letter immediately and forcing a smile, she said, "I did not know before that you ever walked this way." "I have been making a tour of the park," he replied, "as I generally do every year, and intended to close it with a call at the parsonage. Are you going much farther?" No, I should have turned in a moment. And accordingly she did turn, and they walked toward the parsonage together. Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday? Said she. Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again, but I am at his disposal. He arranges the business just as he pleases. And if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he has at least great pleasure in the power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy. He likes to have his own way very well, replied Colonel Fitzwilliam, but so do we all. It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich, and many others are poor. I speak feelingly. A younger son, you know, must be inured to self-denial and dependence. In my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little of either. Now seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you chose, or procuring anything you had a fancy for? These are home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have experienced many hardships of that nature, but in matters of greater weight I may suffer from the want of money. Younger sons cannot marry where they like. Unless where they like women of fortune, which I think they very often do. Our habits of expense make us too dependent, and there are not many in my rank of life who can afford to marry without some attention to money. Is this, thought Elizabeth, meant for me? And she colored at the idea, but recovering herself, said in a lively tone, And pray, what is the usual price of an earl's younger son? Unless the elder brother is very sickly, I suppose you would not ask above 50,000 pounds. He answered her in the same style, and the subject dropped. To interrupt a silence which might make him fancy her affected with what had passed, she soon afterwards said, I imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly for the sake of having somebody at his disposal. I wonder he does not marry, to secure a lasting convenience of that kind. But perhaps his sister does as well for the present, and as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her. No, said Colonel Fitzwilliam, that is an advantage which he must divide with me. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy. Are you indeed? And pray, what sort of a guardian do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble? Young ladies of her age are sometimes a little difficult to manage, and if she has the true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way. As she spoke, she observed him looking at her earnestly, and the manner in which he immediately asked her why she supposed Miss Darcy likely to give them any uneasiness convinced her that she had somehow or other got pretty near the truth. She directly replied, You need not be frightened. I never heard of any harm to her, and I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She is a very great favorite with some of the ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say that you know them. I know them a little. Their brother is a pleasant gentleman-like man. He is a great friend of Darcy's. Oh, yes, said Elizabeth dryly. Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and takes a prodigious deal of care of him. Care of him? Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants to care. From something that he told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture. What is it you mean? It is a circumstance which Darcy, of course, could not wish to be generally known, because if it were to get round to the lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing. You may depend on my not mentioning it. And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars, and I only suspected it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of last summer. Did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for this interference? I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady. And what arts did he use to separate them? He did not talk to me of his own arts, said Fitzwilliam, smiling. He only told me what I have told you now. Elizabeth made no answer and walked on, her heart swelling with indignation. After watching her a little, Fitzwilliam asked her why she was so thoughtful. I'm thinking of what you have been telling me, said she. Your cousin's conduct does not suit my feelings. Why was he to be the judge? You are rather disposed to call his interference officious? I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to decide on the propriety of his friend's inclination, or why upon his own judgment alone he was to determine and direct in what manner that friend was to be happy. But, she continued, recollecting herself, as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case. That is not an unnatural surmise, said Fitzwilliam, but it is lessening the honor of my cousin's triumph very sadly. This was spoken jestingly, but it appeared to her so just a picture of Mr. Darcy that she would not trust herself with an answer, and therefore, abruptly changing the conversation, talked on indifferent matters till they reached the parsonage. There, shut in her own room, as soon as their visitor left them, she could think without interruption of all that she had heard. It was not to be supposed that any other people could be meant than those with whom she was connected. There could not exist in the world 2 men over whom Mr. Darcy could have such boundless influence. That he had been concerned in the measures taken to separate Mr. Bingley and Jane she had never doubted, but she had always attributed to Miss Bingley the principal design and arrangement of them. If his own vanity, however, did not mislead him, he was the cause. His pride and caprice were the cause of all that Jane had suffered, and still continued to suffer. He had ruined for a while every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world, and no one could say how lasting an evil he might have inflicted. There were some very strong objections against the lady, were Colonel Fitzwilliam's words, and these strong objections probably were her having one uncle who was a country attorney and another who was in business in London. To Jane herself, she exclaimed, there could be no possibility of objection. All loveliness and goodness as she is, her understanding excellent, her mind improved, and her manners captivating, neither could anything be urged against my father, who, though with some peculiarities, has ability which Mr. Darcy himself need not disdain, and respectability which he will probably never reach. When she thought of her mother, indeed, her confidence gave way a little, but she would not allow that any objections there had material weight with Mr. Darcy, whose pride she was convinced would receive a deeper wound from the want of importance in his friends' connections than from their want of sense. And she was quite decided at last that he had been partly governed by his worst kind of pride, and partly by the wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister. The agitation and tears which the subject occasioned brought on a headache, and it grew so much worse toward the evening, that added to her unwillingness to see Mr. Darcy, it determined her not to attend her cousins to Rosings, where they were engaged to drink tea. Mrs. Collins, seeing that she really was unwell, did not press her to go, and as much as possible prevented her husband from pressing her. But Mr. Collins could not conceal his apprehension of Lady Catherine's being rather displeased by her staying at home. So it seems Darcy is the culprit, the one who put the wedge between Bingley and Jane. And Elizabeth is not pleased, and neither would I be. Alright friends, I hope that this video has blessed you and inspired you. I hope you're having a beautiful prep day and have a lovely, relaxing Shabbat. I will see you all soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.